Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Guestbrook, also known as the Intrepid Wino. And just the other day I got back from a couple of days in Sydney, and I was up there in an official capacity for my company Lario, representing at the Sydney Italian Wine Festival, which is the inaugural event, and it was held at the Sydney Town Hall. And as you probably could be able to guess, the event is designed to showcase the fantastic Italian wine being brought in by a number of different importers here in Australia. And they also had along some chefs from fantastic local Italian restaurants who were cooking up some food, doing some cooking classes. Indeed, they ran some wine master classes as well. It was just really fantastic, and the whole thing was separated by regions. So I was in there with some of our Friulian wines, which was really fun. It was also a fantastic opportunity to interact with Sydney consumers who are a little bit different to the Melbourne wine consumers. Certainly, a lot in people who work in the wine trade as well. One thing that surprised me was the amount of people who came up actually asking for orange wine. For those of you who don't know what orange wine is, it's wine made from white grapes, but in the method they make red wine, so it actually has skin contact, and so the color and also the contact with oxygen actually gives the wine a sort of an orange color, which is a little bit different. And certainly the consumers in Melbourne are a little bit less experienced with these kind of wines, so that was fantastic. Speaking of Italian wines, the Australian Alternative Varieties Wine Show just wrapped up, where they profiling wines made from alternative varieties, including Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, a lot of different varieties here in Australia. And at the moment, they're actually wrapping up the National Wine Show, which is in Canberra, which pretty much brings to a close the wine show period here in Australia. As I mentioned on a previous episode, the Melbourne Wine Awards, formerly known as the Royal Melbourne Wine Show, was recently held, and which kind of relates to my guest for today. So my guest for today's episode is Tom Carson. Tom is the winemaker at Yabby Lake in the Mornington Peninsula and Heathcote Estate in Heathcote. And Tom has actually just won a very prestigious accolade, the Jimmy Watson Trophy, which I think I mentioned on a previous episode. Jimmy Watson had a wine bar in Carlton, one of the first wine bars in Melbourne, and the trophy, which was started at the Royal Melbourne Wine Show, is for a 1-year-old red wine. And I think up until only recently, the wine was from barrel, but they have since allowed wines that have already been bottled to be eligible for that prize. The Melbourne Wine Awards awarded one of Tom's wines, and it was the first time a Pinot Noir has won, I think, since the 1950s, which is a pretty amazing achievement. Obviously, Australia pretty well known for Shiraz in particular, and a number of other Bordeaux varieties, and it caused a bit of a stir. So I thought it would be really interesting to invite Tom, and he's very graciously offered some of his time to chat. So thank you for joining us, Tom.
No problem.
So Tom, one thing I like to ask people is, what was it? Was there a particular wine? Was there an experience that involved wine? What actually made you discover wine?
Well, it's probably a long story, but back, early on, my father had a cellar. So, and not a big cellar, but a small cellar with some dusty old bottles there. And I do remember the ceremony that went with opening of those bottles, and the enjoyment and the talk and the reverence that was given to the wines that were pulled out. And so that always sort of piqued my interest very early on. But it wasn't probably till a little bit later that I discovered I suppose the potential for a career in winemaking. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that when I was going through school, I thought that it was possible. I didn't give it any thought at all, actually.
Where are you from originally?
I'm from Melbourne, so I grew up out in sort of outer east, Eltham Research Way.
Okay.
And
so almost rural.
Yeah, semi-rural. Back then it was, we were on an acre block, and there was, just cow paddocks behind us that we had great fun playing around in. And it's, quite built up now, obviously.
Yeah.
But that was
urban sprawl.
That was sort of, the late 70s, and it was where all the hippies were living out then, I suppose.
Yeah.
Out to Kangaroo Ground and even further Hurstbridge and Whittlesea and that area. So
I'm sure you could easily find plenty of them, like in Warrandyte, definitely.
Yeah, well, it had a real bush rustic sort of feel to the area, and it was a nice place to grow up. I finished school, finished HSC, and went off to do a food science and technology course at RMIT.
Okay.
Which,
were there many options in terms of studying?
Well, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, so I'd got to the end of year 12 and looked at my score, and it was pretty average, and I got through and thought, well, I can, I was always keen to do further study. I just didn't know what to do.
Sure.
I was sort of interested in that, it seemed at the time, but after about 12 months of that, it didn't really grab me too much, and I thought, look, I'll take a year off, and I worked in a bar for a year.
Okay.
Yeah, Mount Dandenong Hotel.
Right. Okay.
And they had a little wine shop at the front,
Sure.
and a little bottle shop, really, not a wine shop, but they had some decent wines in there, lots of local wines.
Yep.
And in those days, they were all run independently.
Yeah, of course.
They weren't branded corporate sort of hotels that had supply.
And generally it was sort of all associated with hotels and pubs as opposed to sort of standalone shops.
Yeah. So, the guy who was doing the wine buying sort of left, and I was sort of thrown to help take over that and just basically keep the shelves stocked. So I started learning a little bit about, wines and reading up a little bit more, and that certainly got my interest going.
Did you find that you had found extra sensory kind of, you could pick up certain...
Well, I started drinking more wine, that was for sure.
That's going to help.
And I liked the taste of it, and I liked it. So that sort of got me interested, and I was trying various things out of the shop, and just reading back labels and reading books and trying to understand this big wine world. So,
sure.
And then my cousin actually, one of his mates was working in a vineyard in the Yarra, and he said, well, why don't you go and work out in the vineyard if you like this wine stuff? And I thought, well, that's fantastic. So I worked a year at Domaine Chandon.
Okay.
When they were planting the vineyard. So before anything was done there was still the old homestead on the property, and we'd have a smoko in the old cow, the milking shed, and we were out planting vines and driving tractors around, and I learned a lot that year.
So you would have been there with Tony and Bernie?
Yeah, Tony, it was well before Bernie. There was actually a guy called Michael Murtagh who was the vineyard manager back then. Mm-hmm. He actually, it was about 12 months in after the property had been purchased that I started there. So it was right back, we were planting the first blocks on that whole property. Yeah. So Tony was involved. James Halliday was actually doing some consulting and helping out. And they didn't actually have a vineyard manager at that stage. So they...
So James had already established Coldstream Hills.
He was establishing it. Yeah.
Okay.
So he started in '83. This was 1987.
Okay. Yeah.
And into 1988. Uh-huh. So it was when I think they bought the property in '86.
'86. Yeah.
Yeah, and they started planting '87. So we were sort of 87, '88 planting the first vines, and I just met wine people really, I suppose.
Wow.
And learnt about you could study to be a winemaker. So it it sort of flowed from that. Just having that
kind of opened up a whole career
it opened up, and it just sort of this moment like you can actually study to be a winemaker. I really that thought
epiphany kind of thing.
Sort of went through my head. Really, you can do that. It just didn't.
Well, particularly with Tony, because correct me if I'm wrong, but with Brian Crozer, they had pretty much set up the wine school with Charles Sturt University in Wagga Wagga.
Yeah. They had, I'm not sure they had then, or they were working on it. But,
right.
It was just a moment. I thought, well, that's great. I'm going to go and do that. It just seemed to me that winemakers were old people that got, handed the reins of the estate, and
like wine drinkers, I guess.
Yeah,
to a certain extent.
And so that was sort of a moment where I thought, well, that's great. I know what I want to do now. Mm-hmm. And went off to Roseworthy in 89 to 91.
Okay. And had Roseworthy, obviously, how long have they been teaching winemaking, viticulture?
Winemaking, I think it goes back nearly 100 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't anymore because they don't do it there. They do
No.
it at the University of Adelaide, but it has quite a long history. I think at least back to the 30s. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so, I've spoken to a couple of winemakers who've talked about their experiences studying. When you went to Roseworthy, who were some of the other people you were studying with? Sort of what backgrounds do they tend to have?
It was quite a diverse year. I mean, I was a couple of years out of finishing school. There was some guys, some local Barossa guys that were, straight from year 12 into the course because that's what they wanted to do. They come from wine families, so guys like Scott Heidrich, who's the winemaker at Jeff Merrill, and Sam Kurtz, who's chief winemaker at Orlando. They were in my year. They were local guys that went through, basically straight from school into the course.
Yep.
Then you've got other guys like Matt Harrop was in my year.
Okay.
From Shadowfax.
Yep.
So he was roughly my age as well, a couple of years out. And then we had some older, mature age guys, that were studying as well. So. Yeah, it was quite a unique group of people to be put out into an agricultural college in Gawler.
Yeah, of course. Even then there was still sort of the hobby farm kind of people who might have had other careers as doctors, lawyers, even teachers, that kind of thing, establishing, like planting vineyards, and maybe they'd sort of wanted to come back and study a bit of the sort of the science or the sort of the techniques of winemaking. Were there sort of anyone like that in the course?
There was some people that they were just starting the viticultural course as well. So there was 3 or 4 people who were interested in streaming into viticulture. You could do a degree in enology or viticulture. Okay. So it was sort of all together for the first 18 months, and then they went
foundation
off
kind of thing.
And then sort of streamed into viticulture. So there was 4 or 5 people who were interested in that, and there was generally, the industry back then was dominated by the big players, and the small wineries, that were sort of were much less than the numbers were today. So there was a few people from smaller places, but a lot of sort of South Australian heartland type people who were coming through the sort of graduate programs in the big companies where you'd come in, you'd get your degree, and then you'd sort of you'd climb the ladder through the ranks.
So what year and where was the sort of your first official vintage as a winemaker? Was it during your studies or was it post?
Yeah, last final year 1991 of the course was part of the course was to go and do a vintage. So I worked at Tim Knapstein's in Clare Valley.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, and it was...
How did you find the Clare Valley?
Oh, I love the Clare. Yeah, it's a beautiful area.
Yeah.
And it was... Tim had also established his vineyards at Lenswood.
Right, okay.
So it was
in the Adelaide Hills.
Yeah, in the Adelaide Hills. So it was the first... he'd made some wine in 1990, and then 91 was the first official release from the Lenswood vineyard. So, dealing with Adelaide Hills Pinot Noir and Chardonnay back then was really interesting. Yeah, it was great.
So I can imagine some of those regions around Adelaide, since then, in the last 20 years, they've really changed quite dramatically. I'm sure would have been some wineries that were around then that maybe aren't around anymore, whether they've been swallowed up by bigger players and a lot more sort of small producers. Do you get back over to
I go back quite a bit. I've been chairing the McLaren Vale Wine Show for the last 3 years, so I've been going back each year there and various other trips. But yeah, the Adelaide Hills back then was, there wasn't much happening up there. Brian Crozer had established some vines at Piccadilly, and Shaw and Smith started just a couple of years before in '89. So it was sort of pioneering territory, I think.
Sure. Pretty different to the Yarra Valley, I guess. That's got a lot more history going back to the 19th century.
Yeah, that's right. And the Yarra, at that stage in the late 80s, all the talk was, around Coldstream Hills and Domaine Chandon and the big sort of new wave of investment that was coming into the valley. So
De Bortley was around about that time as well?
Yeah, De Bortley's purchased Millers in 85, I think.
I think it was about the same time as Domaine Chandon.
85. So, yeah, there was 3 big sort of new projects going on after the original pioneers had re-established in the late 60s.
And so post graduation, what was your first official job in the wine industry?
First full-time job was at Coldstream Hills, in fact. But
okay.
I went back in '92 and did another vintage at Knapstein's, and sort of worked 6 months there, sort of the first 6 months of the year, and then I went to Burgundy for a vintage.
Wow.
In '92, and came back from that and started working at Coldstream Hills.
And so you came back to the Yarra Valley, and particularly with your sort of experience working vintage in Burgundy, you kind of came back, and I'm assuming had a lot of interest in particularly Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. What kind of opportunities did working at Coldstream Hills back then kind of present for you to sort of experiment and explore and look at different parts of the Yarra Valley?
Yeah, well, there's a number of areas that became sort of learning spots for me at Coldstream Hills. I mean, James and Suzanne would always, you'd work. Back in those days, it was very long days during vintage.
Yeah.
Sort of 7:30 starts and not getting out of there till midnight.
Wow.
But thankfully, James and Suzanne would throw on a lavish dinner most nights, and
sure.
Suzanne would cook up a storm, and James would raid the cellar and bring out some amazing bottles. And
he's pretty famous for that, I think.
Yeah, and it was not it was educational every time. Everything was served blind. You never knew what you were drinking, so there was 3 or 4 brackets per night, and you had to be on your game. It wasn't a drinking session; it was a training session. And there'd be 4 whites put in front of you, and it could be a game like they're all from one region, and name the vintage and tell me what.
Kind of like options.
Yeah, it's like options. So you get led with questions, or it's figure out the puzzle. There's 4 wines here. There's one wine that's the odd man out. Why is it out, and what do the other 3 wines have in common? So
it sounds a bit like sitting the master of wine exams.
Yeah, well, it was serious, but it was fun as well.
Sure.
So it wasn't sort of keeping score and keeping tally, but James
and he didn't feel
James
silly.
had James's background with Len and all those guys in the Hunter was that sort of drinking and enjoying great wine, but really trying to learn to understand it and appreciate it as best you can. So, but have a bit of fun doing it.
Had he started the Australian wine campaign at that point?
Well, yes.
Were you ever around when sort of people were sending in samples?
Yeah, there's always wines to be tasted.
Okay.
He'd go through brackets of wines. I think that one of the funnest days was tasting for the Australian Top 100 when it came to selecting the vintage champagnes and
fun.
Yeah. So it was always good at the end of the day when you had 50 vintage champagnes lined up and they'd all just been tasted, and it's like, well, go for it, guys. Have a look.
What were those early vintages like? I guess in comparison to sort of more recent vintages. Have you seen a huge difference in terms of climatically and?
Yeah, well, vintage was later back then. We've certainly found coming off the drought from '97 onwards, really. Melbourne, Yarra Valley, Mornington, 13 years of consecutive lower than average rainfall.
Mm-hmm.
From that, we've seen the vintage move forward on the calendar.
Yeah.
So we used to, in the Yarra Valley, not really get much going until sort of mid to late March.
Wow.
And now, mid-February is a pretty standard starting time. So it's a sort of jump forward 4, sometimes 6 weeks in terms of when we're harvesting grapes. So that has changed, the period of the year when the grapes are doing their final ripening. So we've shifted from beginning of autumn to end of summer.
Yeah.
So there's often warmer weather. So that is causing more issues in wineries because of what we call sort of the compression of the ripening period. Because
sure.
We've got a shorter time to get the fruit in the winery, get it processed and fermented and into barrel and everything. So, and in hot weather, grapes can ripen quicker. So if you get a bit of a hot spell, things move very, very quickly. Whereas if you're in later March and you're not going to get a 38, 39 degree day in late March, but you can get that in mid-February in Melbourne. So.
Yeah, certainly. I was down in the Mornington just after I got back from overseas, which was, I think, in late February or even early March, and there was a bit of a heat spike, and I think sort of that was causing a bit of concern for people because it had been fairly mild over the summer, from what I was hearing. So, it can kind of put everyone on alarm systems a little bit.
Yeah, I think 93 was quite a cool year. There was a lot of rain. It was quite late. We didn't really get picking until April.
Yeah.
At Coldstream.
Wow.
With the first fruit in the winery, and we were going through to the end of May, whereas that wouldn't happen today. So that's one of the bigger changes we've seen with drought / global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it.
I remember when I started at Chandon, the winemakers would always be really ecstatic if they could get vintage well and truly done with by Easter. It's like, yes, we can actually have the Easter long weekend. And now it's at that point it was pretty much guaranteed that you'd be finished by Easter. I guess depending on when it fell on the calendar. How long did you spend at Coldstream Hills?
I was there for 2.5 years. Yeah.
And were you still kind of going over to Europe working vintages?
Yeah, I worked 93 in Burgundy, so I did 92, 93, and then I went to work for a very small place called Yarra Edge.
Yes.
Which
is where Matt Steele worked, I believe.
No, he worked at Yarra Ridge.
Yarra
Edge was a 12-acre vineyard.
That's on
it's on Edwards
back road.
Yeah, off Coldstream Hills Road. There was a family there, the Bingham family, that had set it up and established a little label, and so I did all.
I think there was a Yarra Edge wine, like an older vintage, at that trophy winners lunch.
It could have been.
I think so. I remember seeing that.
Yeah, so that was they made a Cabernet blend, and when I was there, we planted some Chardonnay Pinot as well and got that going. So, I worked there for 2 years, but I was the only employee, so I did all the vineyard work, pruning, spraying, all the work in the vineyard, and then all the winemaking. So it was a
sort of really drawing on all of your studies to sort of
it was a very steep learning curve, but that experience in the vineyard's sort of invaluable. Really understanding what's happening out there. So that was a very busy couple of years, and then went to Yering Station when they started to establish with the new owners, the Rathbones.
Right. Okay.
So that was 96.
So Yering Station, you said re-established with the Rathbones. Yering Station was actually, I think, was the first winery.
So first vines planted in Victoria.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
In 1838, it was part of sort of 3 wineries back in the late 1800s. So there was Yeringberg, St Hubert's, and Yering. They were the 3 main vineyards back then, and then Yeringberg's last vintage, I think, we're not sure, there's no records from the old Yering days. It's all sort of anecdotal what we know about it, but we believed to have stopped sometime around 1900. St Hubert's about the same time, and Yeringberg's last vintage was 1921.
Wow. Okay. So
and then
hung on a little bit longer then.
Yeah, and the next sort of re-establishment of the valley was the late 60s with Beta Caritas and then John Middleton.
Sure, okay. And I guess going back to that era, what is sort of one of the things that is still around, obviously the Yering Station facility and winemaking facility, and now this beautiful cellar door and restaurant at the front is all very new, but the things that are remaining include where they do tastings. It was a barn of some sort, wasn't it?
It was the original winery, or part of it.
Okay.
And it was converted into horse stables.
Right. Okay.
And then reconverted back into the current cellar door.
And obviously the other big sort of draw card is Chateau Yering, which I would assume is where the family who owned the station.
Yeah, that was the original homestead on the house, which is now luxury hotel.
5, 6, 12 stars.
Yeah, lots of stars.
And we see beautiful restaurant, Eleanor's. Yeah. And so when the Rathbones bought that, they approached you, or they advertising you sort of?
No, they approached me. I met one of the brothers at a tasting. My wife had set up, actually brought out a whole lot of French vignerons for a tasting called France Wine 95.
Whoa.
And 2 weeks before the tasting was to be on to go, they detonated the atomic bomb at Muir Atoll.
Oh, wow. So
there was all this massive anti-French wave of sentiment, and all these poor winemakers came out to this furor. And my wife Nadej put on that tasting to help French vignerons who didn't have representation in Australia come out, show their wares, and hopefully sell some wine and find a distributor,
which they still do.
And it was successful, in fact. And Graham Rathbone came along to that tasting, and I met him, and we started talking about wine. And they talked about Yering Station. His brother had just bought it, and I said, "Oh, well, that's great. Sounds really exciting." And I met the family, and they wanted to talk to me about it, and offered me the job. So it was a pretty quick transition, and started there and helped with the architect design the winery. And
wow, okay,
so I was sort of thrown into the deep end pretty quickly.
I mean, even more steep learning curves.
And
when they were re-establishing Yering Station, was there sort of a particular guiding principle? Were there certain wines that they kind of wanted to make, or they just sort of wanted to make premium Yarra Valley wine?
Yeah, they were inspired by obviously the pioneers of the valley, Yarra Yering's wines, John Middleton's wines, Mount Mary. So they were a little fixated with Cabernet.
Sure.
Which I thought, it's fine. We need to be growing and making Cabernet. It's that part of the valley makes very good Cabernet.
Yep.
But also, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay would be a big part of the future. So it was sort of the mix of the three, and then we sort of had a bit of a play with Shiraz, I think, just to say that there wasn't a lot of people doing it in the valley.
Yep.
And I had tasted some lovely wines, some old Seville Estate Shirazes. Some of the old Millers.
Yarra Yering Dry Red number 2.
Yarra Yering Dry Red number 2. There was a number of wines that showed the potential with Shiraz in the valley. So we put a bit of Shiraz in and a bit of Viognier, and started playing around with that as well. So
what about in terms of bubbles? Obviously, by this point, Domaine Chandon was very well established as the sparkling producer. Did that kind of influence the decision to create a sparkling sort of sub-brand? Was that from the beginning, or did that come a little bit later?
In fact, it was my wife again. Nadej was actually working for Champagne de Vaux.
Right. Okay.
At the time, to assist them in trying to find the right partner.
Yes.
For a partnership, a joint venture.
Uh-huh.
And they've been making wine since 1993.
Yeah.
Their winemaker Claude Thibault would come out. The wines were made at Chandon, and just sourcing little bits of fruit,
just contract growing
fruit, and making these wines. And sort of by the time 96 came around, they'd had sort of 3 years on lease, and it was ready to get going and start selling this wine. And the stars aligned somewhat, I suppose, with me going to Yering, and we introduced the Gillet family from De Vaux to the Rathbones, and it seemed like a really lovely fit.
Okay.
So Yarra Bank was born, and we had a wine ready to go, the 93. So that was sort of nice.
So there hadn't even been any wine released yet.
No, they hadn't done anything, hadn't done any labelling, but they were actively during 95 and 6 looking for the correct, the right joint venture partner to establish a bit of a home base and get the wine packaged up and sold. And
so initially, what were the experiences in terms of completely planting brand new vineyards? I would assume early vintages, were you sort of just buying some fruit to kind of have some wine?
We had the original Yering vineyard, which was 20 acres. So that was planted back in 87, 88.
Okay.
And we, went out, and the Rathbones had bought more land, planted some vineyards, and also, contract growers.
Mm-hmm. And so there was a fairly heavy expansion just initially in terms of...
Well, yeah, we built a rather large winery for the valley, and a restaurant, and, fixed up the cellar door and everything else. So, yeah, there was a lot of activity, planting a lot of vineyard.
Mm-hmm.
and investing in winemaking equipment, barrels, tanks, pumps, everything right from the ground up. So
very capital intensive exercise establishing a brand new winery.
Yeah, they don't pay for themselves overnight.
And so, at what point did you start to sort of say, okay, specific parcels are really presenting as much better, and they might need sort of more time or more new work, that kind of thing? When did you start making reserve wines, or setting aside reserve wines, which is what Yering Station started to get a lot of attention for?
Yeah, right from the first vintage. So 1997, we did 3 reserve wines, and each year it would be based on what we thought was the best parcel. So it would change by variety, by each vintage as to what was sort of presented as the reserve wine. So yeah, it was right from the start. We wanted to isolate the best parcels of the vineyard and make some wines that would establish our reputation as a fine wine producer.
And did you start sort of having single vineyard wines pretty early on as well?
We didn't start that. We did a couple very early on. 99, we did a couple of single vineyard wines.
Okay.
We had one vineyard that planted just on the other side of Yarra Glen that was a nice little spot named after Doug's grandmother, Laura Barnes. So we had we did some Laura Barnes, single vineyard Pinot and Chardonnay.
Right.
So that was back, we started that in 98, and then 99 we had a mate from Burgundy come out and work 99, so we sort of gave him the Chardonnay to play with, and he could have a go at that, and that sort of started the work with the single vineyard stuff. But the reserve was generally a blend of a couple of parcels, and that developed as we went through from sort of valley floor, lower Yarra Valley. We started to go further up into the hills, up past Yarra Junction, Gladdesdale, up there to find cooler parts of the valley, particularly for Chardonnay, that were, producing fruit and wine quality that was more sort of down our stylistic preferences, let's say.
Sure. Initially, it was just Yarra Valley, or just sort of continue to be Yarra Valley? Did they kind of start moving into other regions around Victoria?
No, the sparkling Yarra Bank, we did source some Chardonnay from Mornington Peninsula. Okay. So that wine very early on was generally a blend of Mornington Chardonnay and Upper Yarra Pinot Noir from right up the top at 500 metres above sea level, Wombat Creek Vineyard. So,
yep. Yeah, and so that was sort of the first introduction to Mornington?
Yeah, that was right from early days, 97, 98, yeah.
Okay. And obviously, Yering Station started to get quite a lot of acclaim, particularly for the reserve wines. One in particular was certainly one that when I got introduced to when I started working out in the Yarra Valley, which was the Shiraz Viognier wine, particularly the reserve. At that time, there wasn't really Shiraz Viognier was a pretty unknown blend. People didn't realise that it wasn't uncommon to sort of put a small portion of Viognier in with Shiraz. Did you have to sort of do a fair amount of work, kind of educating people about the Shiraz Viognier blend?
Yeah, look, we started playing around with it 99, 2000 vintage. Obviously, Yarra Yering had been doing it for a number of years in the dry red number 2. Tim Kirk at Clonakilla had been going for a number of years prior to that, and we looked at those wines, and when we looked at the sort of wine we're making at Yering Station, it was much more cool climate Shiraz,
of course,
and we wanted to be able to define that to the consumer somewhat, that it wasn't going to be like every other bottle of Australian Shiraz you've had before.
Yeah, it is Barossa or McLaren.
Yeah, it is different, and so putting Viognier on the front label was a way of sort of
distinguishing,
earmarking the wine that there's something going on here that is not going to be in the traditional slot.
Mm-hmm. And so eventually with Yering Station, you parted ways, and you were, I'm assuming, approached by the owners of Yabby Lake and Heathcote to join them, and that took you to the Mornington Peninsula and Heathcote concurrently. How did you find the shift there? What sort of you're taking over and possibly putting your stamp on the place?
Yeah, look, when they approached me, I'd been at Yering Station for 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
The Rathbone Wine Group had expanded somewhat with Parker, Coonawarra, Mount Langi, Xanadu.
Yeah.
They're building a big facility down in Port Melbourne, warehousing, bottling facility.
Sure.
And I was feeling it was getting pretty big.
Yep.
And so it was a combination of the opportunity at Yabby Lake and maybe just a combination of, this is maybe getting a little bit too big for my liking.
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of the scope of the business and the number of people that were working in it, just the whole general feel of it. So it wasn't that I was unhappy, it was just a sort of a rumbling of doubt about where this was going to go in the future. And
after 12 years, you'd sort of been able to achieve a lot of great things.
Yeah, and when I looked at Yabby Lake and Heathcote estate, what attracted me was that there's 2 vineyards that are exceptionally well positioned. The site selection was fantastic. They'd really done their homework on planting the vineyards and making sure that different soil types were followed and clonal differences, and they'd really done their homework on establishing the vineyard, which was sort of rare back then. People just sort of bought a piece of land and said, I want a vineyard and go and get me the vines, I want to plant this and that and the other, without a great deal of thought about clones and soil types and aspect.
Sure.
So I saw huge potential in the 2 sites, and I looked at the wines. I thought, well, they're pretty good, but I reckon they can be a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the sort of the attraction. Just working back on a much smaller scale, very hands-on. The winery is really beautifully equipped. The vineyards are really well set up. There was no contract winemaking. There was no contract growers. There was nothing cluttering the focus of what they wanted to do. So that was a great attraction to say, well, you can really sink your teeth into this and understand the vineyard exceptionally well. You've got the equipment. There's sort of no excuses to be able to bring these wines to life. So.
Yeah. At the same time, it presents a really interesting opportunity to work into a little bit different regions, particularly climatically. The Mornington Peninsula obviously being quite a cool climate, and Heathcote being a slightly warmer climate. You sort of can work with, again, different varieties and different styles. I'm sure that sort of was an attractive prospect as well.
Yeah, it was the focus too of the 2 properties. So Heathcote was pretty much all Shiraz. There's a little bit of Grenache up there. The brand was strong. They were really focused on what they wanted to achieve with the vineyard and the wines, and then the sort of presentation to the market.
The Heathcote estate certainly was one of the first, with probably the exception of Jasper Hill. So they were one of the ones who actually put the Heathcote region on the map.
Yeah, it was definitely part of it. They've only really been selling wine from Heathcote. I think the first release was 2002. So the brand's come, quite a long way in a very short time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And same with Yabby Lake. It was a focus of, Pinot, Chardonnay, the right clones, the right aspect, lovely packaging, really, really thoughtful right through the whole process. So, that was a real attraction. It was, focused on achieving, really the best wines we could possibly make off really good sites with, really smart sort of business sense as well.
So when you stepped into that position, from memory, in terms of the Yabby Lake range, it consisted of essentially sort of 2 ranges. The Yabby Lake range, which had that beautiful, very clean, pure white label, and then the Red Claw range, which I think consisted of Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and I've actually, when I was down in Mornington, I did pop into the cellar door and have a bit of a taste, and noticed that certainly just within the Red Claw range, there's been a little bit of expansion there. And I think has there been incorporation of some of the Heathcote fruit into that range as well?
That's
so
right.
Sort of Shiraz and Rosé as well. In terms of the Yabby Lake range, was there an expansion of that?
We have done a few things. We've done a Yabby Lake single vineyard Pinot Gris for the last couple of years, and a Syrah, which is there's a small amount of Syrah planted on the vineyard. So we've started bottling that, and those two wines are generally limited in the trade but available at cellar door.
Right, which obviously is a perfect opportunity for people to get down to the cellar door, which does have a beautiful aspect over the vineyard, and so it's lovely to sit out on especially over summer. Sit out on the deck.
We've got a great range of stuff at cellar door, and we wanted to, I wanted to make sure that there were things there that you couldn't get anywhere else. So that, when you arrived, you can buy back vintages of the wine at the cellar door. You can't get them anywhere else. You can buy back to sort of 08 and 07s and 6s, whatever you want to buy. We've got limited amounts of them there. And then smaller bottlings of bits and pieces that we do exclusively for cellar door. So.
Sure. 2008 was the first official vintage at Yabby Lake and Heathcote Estate. And I know that... sort of the big thing to come out of that vintage, which certainly got a lot of attention and was, I guess, your stamp on Yabby Lake as the new chief winemaker, was to release single block Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and I know from that 2008 vintage, volumes were exceptionally limited, as they probably continue to be. How did you sort of approach that? Sort of a much more premium kind of positioned Pinot Noir Chardonnay wine. How did you approach the owners and to sort of convince them that this was a really fantastic way to move forward?
Well, I didn't really ask them; I just did it.
That great.
I mean, we definitely discussed it, but. It was like, this is the direction I want to go. When the vineyard's quite, compartmentalised, there's blocks, and within the blocks there's varieties, and within the varieties there's different clones.
Right.
So there's lots of options there. There's only 10 blocks, but the sort of permutations and combinations come out that there's quite a lot of different combinations in terms of that. So, to learn more about the vineyard, each of those little sections are made separately as complete wines within the winery. So, Pinot and Chardonnay, we might make, 40 different wines off the vineyard each year. Yeah. Based on clone and maybe some winemaking techniques, like some whole bunches in the Pinot, some with not. Yeah. They're suddenly two separate wines, and then there's a clone, a block, etc. Right. And it was just about saying, well, look, if we get a little parcel, something we've done that we think does look really exceptional and different and full of personality and character, let's bottle it separately. So
essentially what you did was, rather than asking for permission, you asked for forgiveness.
Yeah, a little bit like that.
And I think you've been pretty vindicated.
Yeah, they were excited about the project, and I said, it's a way for us as winemakers to learn about what happens in the vineyard and what we do throughout the year in the vineyard, and then how we can bring that to life in the winery. Yeah. And then what we do in the winery to either enhance the potential we've got, or realise the potential, let's say, or sort of detract from it. And unless you sort of bottle those batches separately and watch how they age, you're only going to speculate about what is actually working and where can you improve. So it was a bit of a learning process. It was certainly, I thought it would work in the marketplace, because, I think people love the story. I wanted to tell more about the Yabby Lake story. Yeah. It seemed to me when I got there, it was all a bit mysterious. Sure. Where is the vineyard? They don't have a cellar door. Who are these people making this wine? It was a bit hard to get hold of it.
That takes me all the way back to my first visit to Mornington. I think it would have been about 2005, maybe. And I knew, I think, because I was going based on James Halliday's Wine Companion, and I think Yabby Lake had 4.5 or 5 stars already, and I was like, well, how can I visit? How can I taste these wines?
Yeah. And I felt the same a bit. I thought the brand was a little bit aloof. It was a bit hard for people to really buy into it.
Which is not uncommon in Mornington, let's be honest. Yeah. There are plenty of sort of really small producers.
I wanted to ground it and make it feel real and explain the story of the vineyard and the site. And so part of that was doing these wines that would enhance the single vineyard wine. So previously they weren't labelled single vineyard. It's like, well, let's take it to the next level. Let's do, small single individual block wines,
of course,
which will enhance the reputation of the single vineyard wine. And the story will be much easier to tell about, the vineyard, the site, what's going on there, how the wines are, and
sure.
And then obviously establishing the cellar door is sort of, the next layer of that. So yeah, it was sort of part of a strategy to ground the brand and give it some real authenticity.
Give people something to connect with.
Yeah.
How many different single block wines were released from that first vintage in 2008?
3.
So there was one...
Two Pinots and one Chardonnay.
And one Chardonnay, okay.
Yeah.
And have you made single block wines every vintage since then?
The only vintage we didn't was 2011.
Okay.
So 2009 we did only 2, and they were tiny quantities, only 100 dozen each,
right?
Because of the yields were minute in 2009. 2010 we did 3, 1 Chardonnay, 2 Pinots, nothing in 11, and then the 3 we've got this year, which is two Pinots and 1 Chardonnay.
Okay.
But they've been different blocks all the way through. So
that's an interesting story as well.
Yeah. So the first block 2's probably Pinot has been the one that has been consistently one Pinot that has always come up to the sort of the level we expect. And it's quite funny. The Chardonnay's alternated between block 1 and block 6. So every time we've done it, it's gone block 1 one year, then block 6 the next year, and it's happened again.
And have you taken that approach to a certain extent up at Heathcote Estate as well?
Yeah, we are doing some block wines at Heathcote, similar philosophy behind it. And again, we didn't do any in 11. We've just released the 2010s, which is a block and an F block.
Mm-hmm.
They use letters up in Heathcote and numbers down on the peninsula, so that probably helps us a little bit.
It's like Sesame Street.
Yeah. And that's a similar philosophy. Yeah.
And which was the block that did it this year? The
Jimmy Watson was the block 1 Pinot Noir 2012.
Wow, pretty amazing.
Yeah.
What sort of throughout your kind of winemaking career, or I suppose certainly in terms of Young Station and more recently with Yabby Lake and Heathcote Estate, I'm sure you've had the opportunity to sort of travel and see other parts of the world in terms of their wines. What kind of what have you seen in that period of time that's kind of made you really sort of stand up and take notice of certain areas? I mean, where do you think is sort of the future of wine in terms of maybe outside of Australia?
Yeah, I think we've seen obviously in the last 10 years, the top wines of France, be traded even more than they have as commodities than they have in the past.
Sure.
And putting them out of the reach of normal people.
Yeah, of course.
And I think that's a bit sad. I used to love Bordeaux because of the fact that it would keep people away from Burgundy, because people with money it's easy to understand Bordeaux. We've got our 5 first growths and we make 25, 30,000 cases of them, and we charge a lot of money for it. Yeah. It's easy. You can understand that. We've got a second growth, our third growth. But Burgundy is...
At least there are wines to buy. Burgundy,
yeah, and you can buy them, and they're overpriced or not. That's somebody's opinion. But it was easy to understand for people with money and easy to show off and
sure.
whatever else.
Sure.
And it sort of kept people away from Burgundy, because Burgundy was more complex. Tiny little vignerons making maybe 100 cases of this and 200 cases of that. Mm-hmm. Variations of vintage and producer and vineyard didn't indicate quality, although it would indicate price, and all the different layers in Burgundy that tend to baffle people.
Sure.
But the prices of Burgundy in the last 5 years, since probably the 2005 vintage, have just been extraordinary. I mean, it's just really put wines out that we could afford to drink and enjoy into the stratosphere.
Sure.
The trip has gone 3, 4 times, 5 times in price, from maybe a couple of $100 for a really good Grand Cru from a good producer to over $1,000, and it's like, well, that's just it's taking it out of. I think taking it away from people who love it, and that's and understand it and drink the wines and put it into a sort of a commodity that's traded and bought and sold, and that's a real shame.
That has been sort of one of the sad things about Burgundy is the fact that it has become more of a commodity, as you say. The one thing that I will say about Burgundy is at least that it is driven by supply and demand. Of course, unfortunately, they've suffered some pretty tiny vintages recently, which has meant that they've had a lot less wine. But you are right; it's just sort of it's pricing everyone out of the market. But fortunately, I mean, do you feel that the quality of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay outside of Burgundy has improved significantly?
Oh, definitely. I mean, in Australia, in the last 10 years, it's quite noticeable. I think with Chardonnay, there's always been very good Chardonnay in Australia made from cooler areas.
Sure.
It's definitely improved in the last 10 years, but I think those wines, the wines we're loving today, were being made 10 and 15 years ago. It's just that people weren't talking about them, or they didn't really understand.
Or didn't have the taste for them.
Or just didn't understand what good cool climate Chardonnay should taste like.
Sure.
And we're looking for much more sort of exuberance. But Pinot, with vine age and experience and know-how, we've got to a point where we are making some seriously good wines that would stack up against the best from anywhere in the world.
Well, certainly the Mornington has always been my favourite place for Pinot Noir. It's sort of hard. It is hard to compete against Burgundy. It's like saying New York and the United States. Like, you can't compare New York to anywhere else because it's completely its own thing. Burgundy is like that. But Mornington still is my favourite place for Pinot Noir. I've certainly really liked what's been happening with Chardonnay in the last sort of five years or so in Mornington. In the past, I think the expression was a little bit confused somehow, possibly a little bit too much oak and mallow kind of manipulation going on. I have liked sort of bringing it back to sort of basics. That's been happening in Mornington. I think certainly the Yarra Valley has been doing that better for a bit longer than the Mornington has in terms of Chardonnay. But it's sort of interesting to sort of see, and particularly certain things have really lifted the profile of Pinot Noir. Obviously, you can't discount winning the Jimmy Watson Trophy. But did you find there was much of an effect from the film Sideways, for example?
Well, I think Pinot, the Jimmy Watson win is really a win for Pinot Noir.
Sure.
And Pinot Noir lovers. It's put it centre stage for everybody who loves it, which is fantastic. I mean, I think people have been gradually falling in love with Pinot. Pinot's not a wine that people start their wine appreciation with.
Only true winos, when they get to Pinot, they kind of go, oh, yeah, okay.
It's where you end up.
Sure.
So it does take time. People get burnt with Pinot. People have been burnt buying expensive bottles of Burgundy that have been terrible and overpriced and awful. They've been burnt doing the same with Australian Pinot that's overpriced and not very good. Certainly there was a big image problem in the 90s with Pinot because there was a lot of people, who were making Pinot in cool areas, charging too much for it, overcropping it, not making very good wines, and people were disappointed. So it had a big image problem, and it's taken a while for it to recover from that. And I think in the last 5 years, definitely we've had a couple of really strong vintages. There's been a lot of really good wine around,
Sure.
the 2010s and now the 2012s, and people, can't help but take it seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good to see. I mean, for if anything, just to allow people to sort of drink Australian wine, or certainly Australian red wine, that is a little bit different expression from the kind of wines you were getting from the 90s and early 2000s, is really very large wines.
Well, it is a general trend, is that people are making wines that are more consumer friendly, let's say,
food friendly as well.
Food friendly and easier to understand. So they're not about these big, heavy, oaky wines. There's lots of really smart wines being made in McLaren Vale, for instance, which
Sure.
used to be a little bit pigeonholed in the big chunky Shiraz with loads of oak. There's some people doing some fantastic, blends of Grenache and Shiraz and Mourvedre, and really interesting, food-friendly, beautifully balanced wines. And I think that is what consumers want. They don't want to they want to pick up wines that go, it's delicious.
Sure.
And Pinot is a wine you can drink when it's young. Then you can age it if you like. But they should be delicious. You should be through the bottle without even thinking about it.
Yeah. One of the benefits, I guess, of Pinot Noir, that being a little bit lighter, you don't have any issues even ordering a second bottle.
No, that's right. I mean, light on, tannin, but big on flavour. The best ones have, really loads of flavour and layers of flavour, and that's what's captivating about it. It is, they're delicious. They should be delicious.
Well, Tom, congratulations again for that big win for you and for Pinot, and obviously for the rest of the team down at Yabby Lake. And I'm sure there'll be no issues selling out the rest of that wine. But absolutely, I'm sure there'll be a little bit at Cellar Door available for people. So I do highly recommend getting down to the Mornington and making a stop at Yabby Lake and trying some of the wines that Tom has been doing such a fantastic job making since 2008. Thank you very much for joining us. Any exciting things happening at the Cellar Door over summer that people would?
Well, we are trying to keep the wine, the Block 1 Jimmy Watson winneron at Cellar Door for as long as we can. We're actually serving it by the glass, so if you don't feel like you can afford a whole bottle of it, you can sit down and try before you buy a glass of it, and it's on tasting as well. So it's fantastic. It's driven a lot of traffic to our Cellar Door and people coming in and learning more about us. So it's been a huge win.
Fantastic. And you are on Twitter at Yabby Lake.
Yep.
And that's actually you.
That is me.
It says Tom Carson.
Yes, I do all the tweets. Yeah.
Which is really good to see.
Yeah.
And obviously the Yabby Lake and Heathcote estate can be found online. Do get in contact if you'd like to find out where you might be able to source those wines wherever you are. But yeah, I do recommend just hit up Tom on Twitter. But thank you very much for joining us today, Tom.
Great, thank you.
Thanks again for listening, guys. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at IntrepidWino, or you can follow the podcast at the Vincast. Please do visit my website, www.intrepidwino.com, where you can find all the episodes. But do please subscribe, and you can download the episodes on iTunes. And I'd love some ratings and comments. But until next time, bye.